You strong.
A month passes. A fancy carriage drawn by horses rides along the green grass. Andreas and Emmy are riding in the carriage in silence. Andreas is concentrating on reading a book. Emmy, sitting opposite him, has no idea where Andreas is taking her. He tells her that he has something to show her. Emmy looks at Andreas excitedly. She only went with him because he said he returned the ring. She wonders where they're going with the curtains closed. She wonders how Andreas can afford such an expensive carriage. He still continues to read the book intently. Someone's voice announces that they are in position. Andreas slams the book shut. Emmy looks at her brother perplexed and asks him about where they are and what does he want to show her. She can't wait to find out. Andreas smiles enigmatically at his sister and tells her that she will see everything now. Emmy hears someone say that Andreas is right and that they will see everything as soon as they get out of the carriage. Her eyes widen. The door of the carriage opens. A good-natured woman in spectacles and apron stands before them. She speaks kindly to Emmy and is delighted to see her back. Emmy can't believe her eyes. It's Lupin. Emmy looks at them perplexed and doesn't understand what is going on here, and why is Lupin here. Andreas calmly explains to her that he asked her to work as their headmaid again. Emmy looks at him confused with her mouth wide open. She tells him that he can't afford it now. She takes Lupin's hand and pitifully tries to explain to her that she's sorry because her brother doesn't understand anything yet. Suddenly her gaze stops on something behind Lupin. Her eyes went wide with surprise. Emmy carefully tries to climb down from the carriage. Lupin stands beside her. She holds onto Lupin's hand to keep from falling. Her gaze is fixed on what she sees. She can't take her eyes off of it. Lupin also stands and looks on with pride. She slowly approaches the house with the red roof. Lupin follows her slowly. She gazes admiringly at Applewood Manor. Her eyes are wide open, her breath caught. A warm memory arises in her mind. They are sitting on the front lawn of this house. Little Andreas is running around with a net, trying to catch a dragonfly. Little Emmy sits on her father's lap and smiles sweetly. Emmy turns to Andreas and asks him why he brought her here. He immediately hands her a folded piece of paper wrapped in red tape and tells her to read what it says. Lupin stands enthusiastically looking at them. She is in anticipation of what will happen when Emmy reads the document. Emmy reads the document with trembling hands and can't believe what it says. She asks her brother if it's true. Her eyebrows rise. She can't believe he bought their house. She asks him how he did it. Slightly angrily, she tells Andreas not to say that he raised the money doing something bad. He's holding a clipboard. He shows her something on his tablet and tells her that he has invented a potion. Emmy looks at her brother in surprise. The tablet shows a photo of people, one of them Andreas. He explains that because of this, he was able to make money and buy back their estate. Emmy looks at her brother in silence. He explains to her with great affection that she doesn't have to work so hard anymore. He tells her that from now on he will transfer money to her account every month. Emmy lowers her eyes in a daze. She says faintly that she did not know or even guess that he had worked so hard. Suddenly, a memory of yelling and cursing at Andreas over the ring in the pub pops into her head. She becomes very ashamed of it. Tears stream from her eyes. She says that she was so cruel to him that she told him not to come back. She pitifully tries to explain that she didn't mean to say that. Andreas reverently strokes her head and tries to reassure her. Smiling, he tells her that he understands and that he will now act like a responsible brother. The beautiful ginger-roofed manor house has come back to them. Emmy turns to Andreas and tells him that she always believed in him, but then got really mad at him because of the ring. Andreas calmly replies to her that he knows that. Lupin stands silently watching. She was so moved by the whole situation that tears came to her eyes. She wipes them away gently. A faint and dim light creeps in through a large grated window. On the floor lies the breathless body of an animal. There are magical symbols painted on the floor. Andreas sits on a chair not far from it. Andreas scrutinizes the book that Mr. Morn has placed in his hands as a gift. He thinks about the second awakening achievement he received. He is well aware that because of the trait he received as a reward for the achievement, he can learn necromancy much faster. It says on the electronic scoreboard that enlightenment has occurred. It's epic, and the deeper he delves and studies something, the better chance he has of understanding the theory. As he studies the book, important terms are put aside in his mind. such as blood curse, death fury, skeleton summoning, etc. He realizes that it will now take him less time to learn skills and gain knowledge. Andreas turns to see the corpse of an animal lying on the floor. He decides that since he can summon a spirit, it's time to try it on Timur. He puts his hand up in the air. He hopes that everything will go smoothly. He's been over every possible reason for a failed draft 10 times over. Andreas decisively springs into action. He focuses on Timur's body. The initial necromancy, spirit summoning, takes place. A glowing blue mana forms around Andreas. He holds a book in one hand and tries to summon a spirit with the other. A corpse is discovered. Flashes of blue and purple colors begin to burn in his chest and stomach area. He could now use the dual core to its fullest potential. A suitable object for necromancy has been found. Andreas stretches his hand forward and begins to summon the spirit. He is completely focused. In front of Andreas stands the skeleton Nickel and the ferocious tiger Timur. Nickel has evolved as well. Andreas surmises that if Timur's strength is also added, he has the power of one entire squad. Andreas, with a serious look, calls for the ruler of the tiger tribe, throwing the entire continent into a quiver. Timur's tiger paws begin to move. His abilities summon the potential of the summoner that is Andreas. His stability is lowered. The tiger's eyes slowly open. His muzzle is wrinkled. An additional property has been applied to him. His red eyes go wide. They are filled with terror. The initial necromancy is taking place. The spirit summoning is successful. He is legendary. A powerful force is beginning to awaken in Timur. His level is high, added status effect. Tiger Timur rises on his paws. He looks frightening and ferocious. His eyes are bloodshot, his mouth is open. Sharp teeth and fangs are visible. Its level is increasing. He is now extremely high. It's been upgraded. The subject becomes a battle spirit. Andreas looks at him admiringly. Compared to him, he is quite small. Timur's tiger corpse level has reached its limit. Some of his former ego is returning to him. The tiger opens its mouth wide and roars. The roar happens with the most powerful force. His fighting spirit is legendary. He is an undead. Class 5. Mana is 891. His hallmark is ego, and his skill is fist fighting and berserk. Andreas smiles contentedly. He admits that even his growl is kind of imba. He's glad for the soundproofing magic he's put on. Andreas stands proudly in front of him and says that he will be his master from now on. Tigre Timur squats obediently and bows his head before him. It is a clear, sunny day. The leaves of the trees sway gently in the wind. Time passes. Sunset is already visible in the sky. The sky is illuminated with bright sunlight. The leaves on the trees have taken on a golden color. Autumn has arrived. A cold winter has come. The trees were covered in a blanket of snow. A large number of people piled up on the edge of the mountain. A snowstorm is raging. These are the snowy mountains of Wilbur, the domain of the Marquis of Magna. A man in a robe with a fur collar smilingly addresses the students. He tells them that he will now give the gist of the exam. The students, hooded in their fur robes, listen intently to the professor. He tells them that the subject of the test is survival and collecting points. All of them must spend 72 hours on this mountain. Andreas stands among the students and listens carefully to the task as well. They will need to collect points hidden all over the mountain. The blonde-haired girl with a smile on her face tells the girl next to her that she is sure that she will take first place again. The professor explains in a focused manner that their bracelets also give them points, so they can take the bracelets of other participants. He urges them to remember that if they fail to continue the task or damage their bracelet, they will be immediately disqualified. The students stand startled and look at the professor. The words spoken make their eyes go wide. The professor says that this is the end and tells everyone to put on blindfolds. The leader must take them to the starting point. The students obediently complete the task and slowly scatter around the mountain. The raging blizzard does not subside. Flakes of snow fall and fly. It's hard to see anything because of the blizzard. It's snowing relentlessly. There are caps of snow on the mountainous rocks, which continues unabated. A clawed hand grasps at the rocks to hold on and keep from flying down the cliff. Andreas is climbing to the top of the mountain. This is the cliff of Mount Wilbur. The blizzard continues unabated. Approximately 46 hours remain until the exam is over. He manages to grab onto the very top of the mountain. He holds on tightly to the top of the mountain with his bare hands, trying to climb it. Andreas finds himself on top. He crouches down to catch his breath. Here is a flat area on top of a cliff, which can be useful for both offense and defense. In the distance, he can see someone's silhouette in a magic ball. Andreas stares thoughtfully at the silhouette. His mouth is slightly open, his eyebrows furrowed. Dina Alwyn is in a magic ball. Her gaze is devastated and frustrated. She is simultaneously using terrain search and applying a barrier to keep her from being attacked by opponents and hindered by the blizzard. The flashes of light that show her the way and the magical orb protecting her merge together. Andreas realizes that she is protecting herself and is sure to find the way, but the mana costs would be unthinkable. Dina sits up frustrated. The ball formed around her begins to fade as the flashes of light begin to disappear. Andreas slowly approaches her. He stops and looks at Dina thoughtfully. She sits on her knees with her head down. Andreas stands there, eyes wide. Finally, he realizes that she has used up all her mana. He slowly approaches her, pacing through drifts of snow. He assumes that if he takes her bracelet, he can get rid of a strong rival. Dina hears the creak of sneezing footsteps behind her. She turns around, frightened. Andreas continues to approach her. If he doesn't take her bracelet and leave her alone, she will be helping him, and it will be easier for him to get a higher grade. Dina doesn't immediately realize who exactly is approaching her. Furious, she starts defensively, emitting blue flashes of light towards Andreas. She tells him not to move. Andreas calmly approaches her and tells her that she seems to have used up all her magic. The girl recognizes Andreas and says his name confusedly. Andreas looks at her judgmentally and says that magic is useful, but if you use it recklessly in an area like this, you'll be in trouble. Dina tries with all her might to defend herself against him, exposing the glowing blue mana in front of her. She thinks he wants her bracelet. She asks him why he's pretending to give her advice. The light from her hands shines faintly. She begins to say that even though she has no powers against Andreas, she doesn't have time to speak and looks at her hands. Her power is running out. Her hands stop emitting light. She looks at it with horror. Andreas slowly approaches her. Dina paces back in the snow in fear so that he can't take the bracelet away from her, after which she will be removed from the game. Andreas offers to help her. She angrily yells at him to stay away from her. Dina's eyes are full of terror. She sits on the snow and dodges him. She screams for Andreas to stay away from her. Andreas is starting to lose patience. He rolls his eyes. He calmly asks her about her not wanting to team up with him so badly. Dina incomprehensibly looks at him and asks what he wants from her. Her eyes are wide open. She is puzzled. Andreas's words make her speechless. He asks her if she would like to team up with him and become a team. Dina calms down and sits up. She doesn't understand what he needs this for. Andreas sits down on the snow and adjusts his hood. He holds out his hand to her with a smile on his face and calmly tries to explain that he would be in danger alone if anything happened. It wouldn't be a bad idea for him to have a partner just in case. He asks her what she thinks about it. Dina looks at him suspiciously. Her eyes are filled with anger, her eyebrows furrowed. She agrees with him, but she can't trust him. Andreas looks at her gloatingly. A smirk is visible on his face. His arms are folded. Dina starts to lose control of herself. She holds her head indignantly and asks Andreas why he is doing all this. Is it for pride, reputation, or personal gain? Andreas sits calmly in the snow and looks at her. Andreas looks perplexed at the object in his hand. He wonders what it is. He's holding a bar of chocolate in a rustling gold wrapper. Dina stares mesmerized at the candy bar and drool flows from her mouth. Andreas looks at her with a smile on his face. He knows her weak spot. The blizzard doesn't stop. Flakes of snow fall with the same intensity. Andreas confidently offers her cooperation, but she begs not to misunderstand him. Someone's huge hand is roughly holding a guy with red hair off his head. The guy's face is full of horror and pain. His eyes, nose, and mouth are bleeding. The bloody guy is shown to some weird little green ogre. He's holding a sheet with a picture on it. He is convinced that this guy looks nothing like the one in the picture. The huge ogre annoyedly assures him that he can't see very well. The little ogre angrily tells him that they want the one with green hair. All around them lie the corpses of people who were mistakenly killed by the huge ogre. A scowling, huge ogre is unhappy that the weather is terrible, and he has to stick around for this crappy job. The little ogre, looking off into the distance, tells him that since they are paid, they have no choice. A small ogre stands next to one of the corpses and points his dagger at it. He is enraged that they have been given the worst assignment ever. Suddenly, a purple eye with branches forms above them. It tells them that since they have time to chat, they need to find him soon. They turn around, frightened, and raise their heads. The little ogre turns to the balloon and says it scared him. The hovering eye looks at them. The man in the robe behind him sternly explains to them that this is why he didn't want to address such underdogs. The little troll tells the eye about making inquiries about the person he told them about. The eye looks at him silently. He indignantly asks him why he sent them after the student since he is coming too. His eyes are filled with hatred and anger. Eye turns to the troll and sternly tells him to mind his own business. He rudely tells them to do as they are instructed and addresses him by the name of Jester. Eye angrily tells them to go and kill him. The ogres stand in a daze and stare at him. The small ogre grins at the eye and curses at him, calling him a freak. The huge ogre stared at him dumbly. Jester puts his dagger away in its sheath and offers his partner some rest. He says annoyed that the eye has ruined his mood. The huge ogre refuses and suggests he move on by scent. Curator Ivy, in a fur robe, stands back. The ogres reason that the human odor comes from either the students or the supervisors. 3 students in fur robes stare puzzledly somewhere in the distance. Andreas and Vivian stare ahead in concentration. The ogres reason that if they only kill students, they will reach their target sooner or later. The ogres rush off in search of the green-haired boy. They are sure that many of the students will become their enemies, so they need to kill as many of them as possible. The man in the robe controlling the eye stares after them. He is sure that nothing good can be expected from these ogres. The eye floats in the air beside him. The man summons creatures emitting a bright red light. He tells them to divert them to themselves. The summoned creatures form a magical circle on the flat ground, which burns with bright flames. Their leader decides to plant a bomb on top of the mountain by this time. Andreas and Dina take shelter in the cave from the cold and blizzard. They make a fire and warm themselves near it. They are very close to burying Mr. Jester's target. Andreas holds in his hand the 2 bracelets the students need to collect in order to complete the assignment. He now has 6 of them. 2 students are hanging upside down on a branch. They are loudly begging to be let go. They say that blood is pouring into their heads from this position. Andreas and Dina, not paying attention to them, chat about the fact that apparently these students were in first place. They rejoice in their success. Andreas strides confidently forward through the snowdrifts, and Dina follows him slowly. She wonders where Andreas learned to find a target from the trail and catch it that way. Andreas climbs the mountain with determination, Dina staying slightly behind. A protective circle is formed around her. She looks at him and keeps thinking about the fact that he moves well over the harsh mountainous terrain. That doesn't sound much like a mage. Dina scrutinizes him and she can't help but feel as if Andreas is a different person. Andreas walks ahead and Dina stops, not taking her eyes off him. Suddenly she calls out to him. He turns around sharply in surprise. She suspiciously asks him what happened to him and tells him that he used to be a total jerk. Andreas can't hide a smile at the words she says. He thinks about the fact that she, as always, doesn't try to choose her words. Andreas convincingly replies to her that if he had stayed the same, he would have lost everything he had at that moment. Dina stares at him dumbfounded, eyes wide with amazement. Andreas recalls with disgust the moment he lay at the professor's feet and begged not to be expelled from Rodlin Academy. His thoughts change abruptly. He thinks of his sister Emma. She, turned away, sits sad. He realizes that he hadn't thought of her before, despite the fact that she is the only family member he has. Andreas looks at Dina and says convincingly that he realized this and decided that he just needed to get better, and while he was working hard, he discovered that he had a gift too. Dina continues to stare at him in silence without saying a word. Andreas bows his head slightly, putting his hand to his chest. He apologizes to Dina for all the bad things he has done to her. Dina looks at him in surprise and says it's okay. Andreas, to change the subject, asks Dina about what they're going to do next. They're going to aim for first place. Dina's face takes on a determined look. She accepts his offer with absolute certainty. They're headed somewhere. Andreas says confidently that there can only be one winner, and it will be him. Behind a tree, Ivy's handler stands hidden, arms folded across her chest. Ivy stands behind a tree, musing about how Andreas didn't even blink an eye when he killed people during the ordeal with Boleric. Ivy looks at Andreas intently, not taking her eyes off him. She thinks about the fact that he was an asshole, but has recently become a better person. He wonders how he was able to change so much. After all, he lived his whole life like an idiot. He thinks Andreas Cromwell is an interesting guy. Andreas and Dinah, clad in a magic orb, are running somewhere at an unthinkable speed. On the run, Dinah asks Andreas about how long do we have left to go. Andreas, looking at the piece of paper he is holding in his hand, replies that they have about 3 minutes left. A statue of an embittered dragon stands in front of an ancient map. Andreas's hand with the bracelet dangles. He remembers what the professor told them. You can gain points by taking bracelets from other students, or you can get them by capturing points on the map. Andreas notices something in the impenetrable storm. He tells Dinah to urgently prepare for the enemy's attack. An unexpected blow with the axe is directed at Andreas. He flies off into the distance in surprise. Dinah is horrified to see 2 terrifying ogres in front of her. She backs away in fear. Wasting no time, Andreas assumes an attack pose. The axe that had just knocked him off his feet is visible in front of him. The troll snickered and grinned viciously. He's laughing at the fact that there are more brats. A huge ogre is coming up behind him. He's missed them again. The enraged troll laughs evilly and says that his eyes are really for decoration. Andreas scrutinizes the ogres. He hadn't expected to encounter something like that in the mountains. Dinah runs up to Andreas and asks if he's okay. The ogres are heading straight for him. Andreas casts a glance at the people who died at the hands of the bloodthirsty humans. He tells Dinah that he's okay, but they definitely aren't. Dinah looks at the dead bodies in horror. Andreas assumes an attack pose. Diana stands behind his back. Angry ogres stand in front of them. Dinah angrily asks them, "What happened here?" Her expression is one of undisguised hatred. The troll, ignoring them, turns to the huge ogre, calling him Mantos, and tells him to rejoice. Andreas and Dinah look at them questioningly, not understanding anything. The troll pulls out a piece of paper with a picture of the man they were ordered to find. He compares it to Andreas and realizes it's him. He smiles vilely in joy, his eyes glittering furiously. Dinah looks fearfully at Andreas. She realized that he was the one they were looking for. No emotion could be seen on Andreas's face. He stared dumbly at the ogres, not taking his eyes off them. The ogres rejoice that the one they are looking for is in front of them. The troll pulls out his dagger, and the ogre Mantosome clenches his fists in anger. They are happy that their patience has paid off. Andreas asks them incomprehensibly, what do they know him? The troll bloodily licks his dagger. Mantos, smiling nastily, tells Andreas that he's like a non-native. He informs him that they've come to see him. The troll suggests that Mantos kill him and get out of here as soon as possible. Andreas strikes a determined pose. He suggests, since it is him he wants, to let the others go, to speak without witnesses. Dinah looks at him with horror and does not understand what he is saying. She assures him that they should fight together. Andreas looks at her and tells her that some of them are still alive. He asks her to take care of them until the leader arrives. Dinah answers him nothing in response. She tries to object, but Andreas is confident in his abilities. He is sure that he will defeat them and return to her. A troll with a mad face approaches Andreas, holding his dagger. He laughs at the fact that he is sure he can defeat them. Mantos stands behind him with a silly expression on his face. The crazy troll is laughing out loud! He yells that it's fine with them! Andreas stands with a nonchalant expression on his face, not even looking in their direction. Andreas and the 2 ogres are moving far away. Dinah looks after them and says only his name, Andreas. They are approaching a vacant lot. The snow is lying flat on the ground. Andreas asks them in a calm voice if this is the right place. The snow flakes and falls to the ground. The huge ogre Mantos answers yes, affirmatively, that no one will hear them here. The troll looks around. Andreas stands with his back to them. The troll turns to Mantos and asks him about the fact that they should just cut off his head so it can be identified. Mantos resolutely takes his axe with both hands. He is eager to smear Andreas. He speaks of the need to finish him off quickly. The troll laughingly agrees with him. A huge ogre swings his axe at Andreas. At that moment he says fiercely that they are about to see what he is. Andreas stands nonchalantly and stares fearlessly at the huge ogre. The mad troll, pulling out his long tongue, approaches them with great speed. He shouts to Mantos to remember him too. The troll jumps up, holding his daggers in both hands. Andreas draws his sword. Andreas's gaze is filled with confidence. He knows that he will absolutely defeat them. The ferocious Mantos heads towards him, swinging his huge axe in the process. There's a bright flash of light. It's getting hard to see anything. An outraged Mantos looks at what's going on and doesn't realize what just happened. He bows out angrily. The troll looked mad. He brings both of his daggers closer to his face. You can see a snide smile on his face. Andrea, with her sharp sword, cuts off the tip of the axe that Mantos is holding. The point flies off into the snow. The outraged Mantos asks him about the fact that he is not a wizard. A frightened troll stands behind Mantos. Andreas puts his sword away in its sheath. He questions them about being Mantos and glue. He recommends they better forget about the stereotypes that mages can't use a sword. The ogres look at him stunned. They question him about how he knows their names. Andreas mysteriously holds a glowing magic ball in his hand. He assures them that it will answer if they tell him who sent them. The ogres look at each other confusedly and realize that things are bad. Andreas summons Nickel's skeleton and Timur's tiger corpse. They immediately appear behind his back. Andreas looks at the ogres with a smile on his face and says that if they don't want to answer, he will still make them talk sooner or later. They look at him fearfully and realize that Kidwell has tricked them. Glue continues to hold the dagger in his hand, and Mantos wraps the barbed rope around his huge paws. Andreas, hearing their reasoning, thinks about the fact that they are most likely talking about Gauntlet. Skeleton Nickel gets tired of hearing all this, and he resolutely heads off to attack. Andreas orders him to stop. Andreas turns to face him and allows him to kill anyone who tries to escape. The ogres stare at them fearfully, not saying a word. Andreas stands confidently. Nickel and Timur stand behind him. The confused ogres stand opposite to them and, realizing that they have no chance, start insulting him, calling him a cheeky little bastard. Suddenly, a crazed Mantos is heading towards Andreas at high speed while claiming they're not done yet. At this point, Andreas decides to try to use a skill he learned back in his previous life, the combat valor skill. He tries to defend himself against it. Andreas swings his arm at the huge Mantos with all his might. He punches him in the face with such force that he flies off and plops right down on the ground. At that moment, the troll Glue starts attacking him. He points his dagger straight at Andreas, but he manages to dodge. Andreas hits his hand hard enough that the dagger falls out of it. He is partially disarmed. Andreas picks up the remaining hilt from the sword and offers to let Mantos teach him how to use the blade. Troll Glue's eyes are bloodshot, his eyebrows are wrinkled, and every muscle in his face is tense. Andreas swings his blade angrily. The Troll Glue chuckles slyly, trying to dodge the blow. Troll successfully defends against the strikes thrown by Andreas, setting up his dagger. Andreas doesn't give up. He has a completely focused expression on his face. He continues to attack the troll. Ogre Mantos tries to get up off the ground after Andreas's punch. He's having a hard time doing so. He's grunting all over. The mad troll Glue keeps his dagger in his hand and tries to attack Andreas. He has a frantic look on his face, his mouth open so that his sharp teeth are visible. Andreas's eyes begin to glow with a violet light. His expression is calm and focused. Andreas swings his blade with such speed that the mad troll can no longer control his movements. Suddenly, he loses control completely, and Andreas kicks him with his foot with such force that he flies off a great distance with a shriek. Andreas tries to catch his breath. Ogre Mantos has risen to his feet and is standing behind him. Andreas turns around on him and sees that he is standing firmly on his feet. Ogre Mantos is holding his head. He howls in pain. A stream of blood flows from his eyes, nose, and mouth. He curses. Andreas turns to Mantos and asks him not to tell him that he is surrendering. Satisfied with himself, he thinks about the fact that fighting prowess works. Skeleton Nickel and Tiger Timur look admiringly at their master. Nickel folds his arms across his chest. Andreas thinks about how they haven't had a chance to play yet. Meanwhile, Dina is standing next to the students who died at the hands of the ogres. There are two frightened girls sitting next to one of the corpses. She turns to one of them and says that she is leaving them to her. One girl is bandaging another girl's head with a bandage. She turns to Dina and says that they all know very well about her abilities and her position in the academy, but it would be better to work together now. Dina looks at her in surprise. Dina recalls that Andreas said that some of them were still alive. He told her to take care of them until the leader arrived. Dina's expression is devastated. She realizes that she can't just stand by and wait for the ogres to attack the others. The red-haired girl bandaging the other's head says that she understands and that they will follow her as soon as they can. She looks at Dina with hopeful eyes and begs her to stay out of their sight. Dina looks at them with eyes full of hope and agrees with the red-haired girl's words. Mantos is lying on the ground, unable to move. He has no strength left to fight. His mouth is slightly open, his eyes rolled back. Andrea stands over his body and looks at him. He demands that he tell him who sent them to him. Mantos laughs his last breath and tells him to just kill him. Nickel and Timur stand behind Andreas and watch what is happening. Andreas is starting to lose patience. He thinks about how he can get Mantos to talk. Andreas turns to Nickel and tells him to give him the sword immediately. Andreas picks up his sword and turns to Mantos. He tells him that he will do as he wishes. He pulls his steel sword out of its sheath and confidently tells Mantos that he can find out another way. He doesn't have to waste time on him. An exhausted troll named Glue crawls up to them. He blurts out that they were sent by Jester Reuben. Mantos looks at him judgmentally and thinks about why he blabbed. Glue's troll gaze is still as crazy as ever. He tries to explain to Mantos that they owe nothing to those who treat them like animals. Troll Glue continues to slowly approach them. He holds onto one side. The troll turns to Andreas and says that he will say even more. Jester sent more than just the two of them. Andreas stares silently into nothing. Andreas presents the magical creatures in his head with a serious look. He knew someone from the Brotherhood was behind all this, but he didn't expect it to be Jester. Andreas recalls Salem's angry face when he said that if anyone questioned his decision, he would find them and kill them. He is sure that if Jester attacked him despite Salem's threats, then he is sure that no one will know if he is gone. He concludes why the couple massacred him. Andreas turns slightly to the troll Glue and asks him about where the others are. One eye of the troll is covered, the same grin still on his face. He says he doesn't know where they are, but they don't want to cross Rodlin's path either. He suggests that they might be preparing a landslide. The blizzard is intensifying. The flakes of snow are carried by the wind. Andreas realizes that Jester wants to get rid of him by making it look like an accident. He wants to create an alibi for himself so he won't be hunted by Salem and Rodlin. The mad troll Glue turns to Mantos and says that they need to get the hell out of here as soon as possible, lest they get dragged into all this. Mantos lies on the ground, immobilized, and doesn't say a word in response. The troll walks over to Mantos. He tries to help him up by holding him on one side. Andreas looks at them indignantly and asks what they think they can just walk away after killing students like that. Andreas's gaze is filled with determination. He asks them about who told them he would keep them alive. The blizzard is sweeping everything in its path. It's snowing non-stop. The mountain is slowly covered with a blanket of snow. The snowstorm does not stop for a moment. Dina, who has formed a magic ball around herself, walks through the snowdrifts up the hill. She looks around and realizes that she has almost made it to the top. She wonders indignantly, where is Andreas? Something unexpected she sees in front of her. Her eyes are dilated to their maximum, pupils constricted, her lips tighten in horror. Suddenly, she steps on a magic circle. The circle burns with a bright red light, emitting sparks. Dina squats down on her knees and bright flashes of light come from her. She doesn't understand what's going on here or who did all this. She is at the bottom of a hill and sees the mad creatures coming at her with their arms outstretched towards her. In the moment, Dina realizes that these are not the two. She indignantly asks the creatures who they are. The leader of all these creatures looks at her in exasperation. He talks about wondering what little rat has crawled into the place where their ritual is being performed. He is sure that Dina is a common wench. Dina angrily yells at them for sneak attacking and not answering their questions. She asks them not to blame her if she kills them. Suddenly, Dina creates snowdrifts around her that make it impossible for the creatures to see where she is. She's built a defense. She tries with all her might to hold on to that ability. Her eyes are filled with cruelty, her teeth clenched. The leader of these creatures stands bewildered and stares at the scene. He wonders if she is using a double spell, combining snowstorm and ice magic. Furious, Dina shouts, turning to them. She tells them to disappear immediately. As they approach her, the unknown creatures fly off her defenses with unthinkable force. The leader of these creatures angrily shouts at them to dodge. By his side is his trusty eye. Dina looks at them with tears in her eyes. This battle is hard on her. The ringleader looks at how admirably she is doing. He thinks about how her mastery of magic scares him despite her young age. The ringleader continues to stand in the snow and watch. Eye floats next to him in the air. The enraged man grabs the eye, and all he can think is that Dina is just a brat anyway. The eye looks fearfully at its master. The madman puts the newly hovering eye to his forehead. He laughs. Every vein in his face is tense. He says this setting is tempting and he'll play with it until their business is done. The man starts slowly towards Dina, who is full of confidence and anger. There are tentacles coming out of his face. Dina is horrified to realize that the ringleader of these creatures uses dark magic. Outgrowths begin to develop rapidly from the man's head. It looks terrifying. The man's forehead speaks with a bright flash. At this time, Ivy's handler approaches the bodies of the frozen dead students, trying to revive them. Suddenly, the curator hears some sound in the distance and turns around to look at him. His eyes are wide open. She looks up at the top of the mountain and wonders perplexedly whose presence is there. At this time, Dina is actively fighting the creatures. The outgrowths are getting closer and closer to her. They hit her protective orb, trying to break it. Dina at this point realizes that if they continue her mana, she fiercely tries to defend herself against them. The creatures trying to attack her emit magical light of different colors from their hands. Dina hurries away from them as quickly as possible. Dina uses her hands to make colored light flashes around her. The orb guarding her still remains around her. Dina emits bright flashes of fire that emit sparks and explode. A creature with many tentacles tries to grab the balloon. At this time, Dina falls out of it and into a snowdrift. She looks at them confusedly, trying to catch her breath. Her mouth is wide open. The tentacle monster is laughing loudly. He looks mercilessly at Dina, who was lying on the ground. He commands everyone to see what the difference in experience means. His mouth is wide open. He feels his superiority over her. Dina looks at him perplexed. She asks what difference in experience we're talking about, if he just added an assistant. The monster can't believe his ears. He is amazed at how brave Dina is, after all. His helpers are standing beside him on both sides and looking at her nonchalantly. The monster's mouth clenches with rage. He says she's a little thing and that he'll tear her apart. Dina replies to him with a grin on her face that these threats make him look like an even bigger clown. A blue magic ball forms in her hand. Suddenly her expression changes. She looks confused. What she saw shocked her. A monster with tentacles furiously points his hand at her, trying to grab her, and tells her that the games are over. He points a multitude of tentacles in her direction. They are coming at her fast, trying to grab her. Suddenly, the sharp sword carries out several sharp and precise strikes. An unknown guy suddenly appears in front of Dina and cuts off the tentacles aimed at Dina with a few blows. The monster's eyes widen in surprise. Dina stares mesmerized at her savior. Her eyes are wide open, a thin trickle of blood dripping from her nose. The monster's eyes widen in pain. Its teeth are clenched. He is furious to the extreme. Who dares to interfere with him? He looks at him questioningly. Dina continues to sit on the snowdrift. She looks in surprise at the masked man sleeping her and asks who he is. The masked man turns around to look at her. Turning around, he explains to her that he is a mercenary hired by Rodlin. He tells her sharply that he'll take care of it and tells her to get out of here. She wipes the blood away with her hand. Slightly embittered, she asks him about coming out of nowhere and thinking he can handle them. The masked man turns away from her and explains to her that he's not the one they want. He can't call Nickel and Timur right now. Dina looks at him perplexed, squinting one eye. Adopting a fighting stance, he explains to Dina that this monster with tentacles wants to cause a landslide on the entire mountain. He orders her to get out of here immediately. The enraged monster turns to the man and asks him who he is and how does he know all this. Drool spurts from his mouth in rage. The masked man is completely unfazed. He asks him about why he would tell a suicide bomber about this. The monster's fists clench with indignation, eyes bulging. It shouts loudly at him, calling him a cocky fool. The masked man picks up speed and heads for the monster. With his sharp, long sword, he slices the monster's tentacles with all his might. The enraged monster and his helpers are on the attack. There's no way they're ready to surrender. They point magical paraphernalia, colorful glowing orbs, at him. The masked man skillfully dodges them. He covers himself with his sword, thus cutting off the magic balls aimed at him. Suddenly, the masked man disappears from sight. The tentacled monster and his assistants look around in bewilderment, searching for him with their eyes. Suddenly, a masked man appears out of nowhere and starts chopping them all to pieces with his sharp sword with even more fury. Dina watches admiringly, her pupils constrict. She's amazed at how quickly he's handling them. Suddenly, a huge bright red flash of light appears. It could destroy him. Dina frantically starts yelling at the masked man to be careful. She tries to warn him. The man stares upward in incomprehension. The mask makes it impossible to see his expression. There's a bright explosion. Dina tries to dodge it, covering her head with her hands. The masked man thrusts his sharp sword into the monster's throat. The sharp pain causes it to scream, its eyes wide open. The pupil in his eye has narrowed. He is in complete confusion. Thick scarlet blood flows from his open mouth. His eye filled with terror. The veins in it are swollen and red. He cannot fully believe what has just happened. The masked man, slightly crouched, looks at him spitefully and doesn't say a word. Suddenly, the monster strikes the man with its tentacles with such force that the man, having time to cover his face with his hands, is thrown a great distance away. The masked man adopts a determined fighting pose to attack his enemy. Dina stands behind him and watches in horror. At the most crucial moment, Dina distracts the man and asks him if he's okay. He turns his head slightly at her and sternly tells her not to get close. The monster stands there and giggles. The masked man stares intently at his opponent. He realizes that the owner of the body should have died, but he is still alive. The one-eyed monster takes over the man's body. He begins to scream in terror. The man screams with such terror, his mouth beginning to tear open. The monster has practically swallowed him into itself. The monster had already swallowed the man's head. His limbs are twitching convulsively. The masked man watches from the sidelines. The masked man and Dina stare questioningly at the monster as it bloodily swallows the man. His body is no longer moving. The masked man watches mesmerized, not taking his eyes off what is happening. There is a huge explosion. At that moment, the masked man grabs Dina in his arms and rushes away from the monster. The monster chuckles gloatingly as it continues to completely absorb the unfortunate man's body into itself. During the explosion, the monster's helpers stand nearby and don't move, only shout something inaudible. The masked man and Dina hide behind a cliff. Dina is trying to catch her breath. The masked man tells her to run away immediately while he distracts them. The masked man rushes back with lightning speed. The girl shouts after him, trying to stop him. He has already approached the monster and mercilessly chops its long tentacles with his long sword. He acts in cold blood. Dina stares at him admiringly. Her eyes are wide open. She doesn't know him, but he just saved her life. Dina desperately realizes that she can't leave him and run away. She stares at her hands, from which bright blue sparks emanate. The light in her hands begins to burn even brighter and stronger. She begins to feel a powerful force. She realizes that she just has to help him as much as she can. She approaches the masked man and the monster. Watching them from the side, the masked man tells her to take her time and try not to move. He tells her to squeeze the energy. A powerful light begins to emit from her chest. Bright tongues of blue light radiate from her. She looks mesmerized. The man yells at her to make her thinner and sharper. Dina starts emitting ice spears. Everything around her is sparkling. Not believing her eyes, she looks at the fact that she has managed to fulfill all of the masked man's instructions. She begins to emit sharp ice spears. Delighted, she cries out that she has succeeded. A masked man is defending himself against a monster. Thinks about the fact that if he could summon Nickel or Timur, he would easily defeat this monster. He turns back around and his gaze stops on something. He sees Dina behind him, emitting a bright blue light from her hands. Furious, he launches his attack. At this point, he gets angry and thinks about how Dina is a stubborn wench. He wonders why she's still here since he told her to run away. Dina's eyes are full of determination. He raises his hand in the air and decides to help his savior by all means. She throws brightly colored ice spears. Her face is full of rage and hatred. The monster practically engulfed the man's body. Bright beams of light released by Dina headed straight for him. Glowing punches strike the monster. He cries out in horror. A bright blue light illuminates him. The masked man stands silently and watches questioningly. Dina, producing sharp swords, stands directly behind him. The ugly monster screams in terror and shakes its tentacles. Most of the tentacles are severed. A bright purple magic ball can be seen on the monster's body. It's a mana core. The masked man sees it and decides that if he can, he just needs to destroy it. He performs frantic kicks on the tentacle monster. His hair flutters in the wind. The tentacled monster opens its mouth abominably and sticks out its long tongue. The masked man points his sword at it. He was close. He rushed. The monster's tentacles become entangled. Someone suddenly grabs the monster by one of them. The masked man looks questioningly at what is happening. The mask on his face obscures his expression. Suddenly, one of the monster's tentacles digs right into the throat of one of his assistants. The one tries to pull it out with horror, but he fails. His mouth is wide open. All the tentacles are thrusting on the helpers. They pierce their bodies mercilessly. One of the helpers manages to say the monster's name, Mr. Kidwin. But then a sharp tentacle stabs him right in the eye. He howled in pain. His mouth opened wide. The tentacle monster stands in the middle of the plain, having all of his helpers on his tentacles. They hang. Dina watches in horror at this unexpected turn. It makes his mouth drop open. She is amazed that he is attacking his own and wonders why he is doing this. The masked man watches the scene unfazed. He guesses that the monster is just trying to absorb their mana in this way. Sharp tentacles pierce through the bodies of their assistants. They act ruthlessly. The assistants in robes howl in pain. Their bodies are decomposing. Only muscles remain visible. In place of their eyes, only holes remain. Muscular tentacles continue to hold the dead bodies in place. Sharp teeth begin to emerge from the monster's body. Tentacles are starting to come out of the mouth of the horrible monster. They're everywhere. Its mouth is wide open so that its sharp teeth are visible. Its center eye is huge, its pupil constricted. It's merciless. He stands in front of the masked man and chuckles gloatingly. He stands, pointing his sharp sword at him. The masked man stands confused and looks at his opponent. He realizes that he is in a bad way. Unexpectedly, his hands begin to emit blue mana. A bright light illuminates his body. A blue veil forms around his body. He holds a sword in one hand and looks at his other hand with surprise. He guesses that it is a shield made of ice magic. His sword begins to emit a bright pink light. He begins to have an increase in sharpness. The masked man feels an acceleration in his movements. His legs begin to move with even more force. He turns back and sees that Dina is losing her strength. She is squatting with her mouth open. She's coughing. She doesn't look good. Dina has spent all her remaining mana on the monster and its helpers. A masked man stands facing a tentacle monster that looks enraged. An exhausted Dina is squatting. The masked man tells her not to waste her last strength and to run away. The masked man is lightning fast from his spot, leaving only puffs of dust behind him. He runs somewhere and feels that his body is much lighter than it was. His movements are easy and effortless. A monster with tentacles covered in barbs looks furious. His eyes are turning red. Through the mask on the man's face, you can see his eyes. They are wide open and the pupils are constricted. There is a bright flash of light. There are bright sparks coming from all directions. Everything goes flying in different directions. The masked man tries to dodge the blows. He covers his face with his hands and ducks back. He looks at a horrible monster with tentacles with many sharp barbs on it. He lifts his head up and realizes that there is no end to it all. Wasting no time, he aims somewhere with unthinkable speed. He realizes that in order for him to triumph, he just needs to find the monster's core. The man whizzes past the monster at breakneck speed. It stares back at him with its eye in astonishment. Its jaws open in surprise. The skin on the monster's body begins to tear. Its eyes are filled with hatred and blood. The masked man assumes an attack pose. He's crouched on a snowdrift. He senses that it's not deep and bends down viciously. The monster's muzzle sliced into pieces across its mouth. Its eye froze in horror. The monster is tearing itself to pieces. The tentacles are blown to pieces. Its torso is a mess. The masked man stands with his sharp sword in his hand, looking at the dying monster. The masked man stands mesmerized and watches. A bright red light illuminates him. He is pleased with himself because he has found the monster's core. He calmly puts his sharp sword away on his belt. It's finally come to a successful end. Ivy's handler stands enthusiastically watching the scene. Her gaze scrutinizes the masked man. He is very interested in who this man is. The man notices Ivy's handler. He bows out angrily and wonders why she's the one who showed up here. The masked man and Ivy's handler stare at each other in silence. The masked man recognized her immediately, but she didn't recognize him. Ivy's handler stares at him intently. There is a straw in her mouth. She tells him confidently that if he doesn't answer who he is, she will kill him and removes the mask herself. The masked man raises his head high on the mountain. The curator looks at him perplexed and has no idea what he is about to do. The masked man nonchalantly explains to Ivy's handler that the dark mages have set up a large magic circle to explode, and if they aren't killed right now, the students will get hurt. Ivy's handler looks at him indignantly and begins to lose her patience. She indignantly orders him to stop bluffing. She turns her head to the side, and the masked man looks at her and tries to convince her that the place is about to explode. After a second, the masked man disappears from sight. The only thing heard is him saying that he is leaving the students to her. Ivy looks confused at the place where the masked man was just now. Suddenly, she shrieks a loud curse word directed at the masked man. She stands with her legs spread wide and her arms out to the side. Ivy grit her teeth angrily and searches for the masked man with her eyes. She squints her eyes and indignantly swears that she will find him. The masked man climbs up the mountain in a few leaps. He is already at the very top. Climbing to the top of the mountain, he removes his mask. Exhaling, he rejoices in the fact that he has managed to take cover. The masked man is Andreas. A bright flash of an explosion can be seen behind the mountain. Andreas hides behind a tree and watches the explosion. He is confident that Ivy's handler should definitely be able to handle it. The flakes of snow still continue to fly and cover the entire space with snow. The blizzard does not cease to subside. An ancient, gloomy castle sits near the Tanara Strait. It's raining heavily. The breathless body of a mermaid is placed on a magical platform. 4 candles stand around it. A dead raven lies next to the body. Mr. Mosh raises his hands high. A bright red light emanates from them. He looks menacing as he performs a magical ritual. He is puffing and emitting streams of air. He looks very focused and puzzled. Mr. Mosh scrutinizes the body of the dead mermaid. His eyes burn with a blue light. Standing over the body of a mermaid, he holds a magic light in his hands. The room is dark and gloomy. The light from the street falls on the floor. He turns to Salem and tells him that this is his private sanctuary. Sitting on the windowsill, Salem bowed his head. Outside the window, a heavy hailstorm is falling. Mosh turns without turning to him, reproaching him for the fact that well-mannered amateurs usually give warning before they come. A grinning Salem answers him that it is he himself who has no manners. His face is embittered and sly. Salem climbs down from the windowsill and approaches Mr. Mosh. He asks her, addressing him by the name Jester, about underestimating him. Otherwise, how else to explain why he pulled that bullshit? He approaches Mosh with a confident stride, but the man continues to stare blankly into the distance, ignoring him. Mr. Mosh looks at Salima perplexed and says he doesn't understand what the man is trying to tell him. His eyes are burning, but the bottom of his face is still not visible. Salem is beginning to lose patience. He guesses that Mr. Mosh is just trying to play the fool. A green haze of light envelops him. Salem turns to Mr. Mosh angrily and asks him about not being tired of living so long. He suggests to him that Salem cremate him. Mr. Mosh begins to clench his fists in rage. Starting to lose his patience, Mosh wonders what he wants with him. He stares intently at Salem, not taking his bright eyes off. Salem grits his teeth angrily. He doesn't understand why Mosh denies everything, as if he doesn't know what he's talking about. He takes the glass bottle in his hand and opens the cork, scrutinizing it carefully. Reluctantly, he says that the man himself knows. Pouring the contents of the bright orange-colored bottle into glasses, he tells Mosh that if he insisted it was an accident and that he had nothing to do with it, he'd be in serious trouble. Confidently holding his drinking glass in his hand, Salem approaches Mosh, asking to borrow his diligent word for a week. Mr. Mosh stands questioningly and looks at him without uttering a word. Salem brings his glass to his mouth, smiling slyly. If Mosh does what he asks, then Salem will let him go this time too. A large, unpretentious building sits in the middle of the trees. It's a sunny day. A man walks confidently along the brick building. His step is resolute. This man is Andreas. He walks down the hallway, not paying attention to what surrounds him. He stares intently at his clipboard, holding it in front of him. On his tablet, he reads the news. It says that Senior Professor Evie Clare has defeated the dark wizard Kidwell. It goes on to write about a major interview with Imperial investigators. Dom's daughter Alwyn stated that she was saved by an unknown person. He puts the clipboard away in his bag. After Tolman's suspension, Bach personally took over the investigation. The case has taken a serious turn. There's going to be a lot of hype for a while. He realizes he'd better keep his head down for now. Ivy's holed up and watching him. Andreas hears behind his back that someone is telling him that he seems to like the training ground of the Knight's faculty. Without turning around, he shifts his gaze back. Ivy is standing behind him, holding her head, wondering why she had to come all the way out here to find an ordinary mage. He looks at her perplexed. Ivy tells him to follow her. She scrutinizes him closely, keeping her eyes on him. Andreas follows her obediently. Ivy walks ahead of her. He lags behind. They walk down the street. Andreas follows her, looking after her. He hopes she hasn't found out what happened. Ivy turns to him and assumes a confident pose. She has a steel sword on her belt. She asks him if he knows why she is here. Andreas doesn't say a word and watches her reaction carefully. His eyes are slightly squinted. He answers her that he guesses why she showed up here. Slightly surprised, Ivy stands and stares at him. Eyes wide with amazement and at his straightforwardness, she was glad for it, and realized that it would be even easier this way. Smiling slightly, Andreas, apologizing, says that he is not ready to start a relationship with the opposite sex yet. Ivy is hurt by his words and cries out that she will kill him. Adopting a not at all benevolent expression on her face, she informs Andreas that Dina told her about the half-humans who killed the students. She asks Andreas what happened to them. With a nonchalant expression on his face, Andreas answers her that he doesn't know that. He tells her that he already told the investigators that he ran away when they were distracted. Andreas remembers Dina's face. He was grateful she hadn't blurted out that those half-humans were going to kill him. Smiling wryly, Ivy tells him it's all bullshit. She guesses they're not telling him something. Andreas bows his head and closes his eyes. He assures her that it's true and, apologizing, says that he has to go. Andreas wants to get out of here immediately. He makes a decisive move. Suddenly, Ivy starts attacking him. She grabs her sharp sword and starts swinging it with unthinkable force in front of Andreas. Ivy swings her sharp sword at Andreas, and he dodges her sharply to the side, taking a wide step. He dodges the blow. Andreas quickly draws his sword and swings it at her. Ivy's blow passes right in front of Andreas's face, miraculously missing him. The dust from the sword blows is flying around. Andreas tries to pull away from them, backing up against the wall. Stunned by what is happening, Ivy smiles evilly. She is amazed that some scrawny mage was able to block the strike of a senior professor of the Knight's faculty. Andreas looks at his sword in surprise, clutching it tightly in his hand. He realizes that he was only able to block her blow. Ivy, clenching the straw in her teeth, senses that something is clearly wrong here. She scrutinizes her opponent without taking her eyes off. Behind them, behind the wall, Vivian lurks. She stands silently. Andreas turns to Ivy and says, "What is she trying to say, that he's a dark mage?" Ivy doesn't answer him. Vivian stands thoughtfully behind the wall with both arms folded across her chest. She is stunned by Ivy's words. She can't believe that Andreas is a dark mage. Ivy points her sharp sword at Andreas. With a serious look, she tells him about him acting suspicious every time they deal with them. When she investigated Balleric, he even dealt with the mage who locked her up. Ivy recalls the image of the masked man. She thinks about the fact that his voice was different, but his build was the same. She wondered how he had managed to pull it off. Andreas firmly asks Ivy about what she thinks he lied to the investigators. She answers him that she is absolutely sure of it. Ivy gives him a piercing look and goes on to talk about how Vivian has changed since the midterms. She interrogates him about what he did to her. Vivian, hidden behind the wall, stands fearfully listening to their conversation breathlessly, her eyes wide open, her lips pressed together. Andrea stands perplexed and looks at Ivy, trying to find the words to answer. Vivian opens her eyes even wider at the words she hears. Her pupils constrict. She hears Andreas tell Ivy that he had just saved her and nothing more. Ivy can't believe it and asks him again. He convincingly tells her that he entered the barrier and saved her, and that's the end of it. Vivian, who was hiding behind the wall, smiled embarrassedly. She guessed that Mr. Fay was Andreas. A blush came to her cheeks. Vivian suddenly jumps up, her thoughts interrupted by Ivy's voice shouting at Andreas to stop talking nonsense. Vivian glances suspiciously in their direction, folding her arms across her chest. Meanwhile, Ivy pointed her sharp sword right at Andreas's face. She angrily wonders how a lowlife like Andreas can calmly walk in and out of a dark mage's barrier. Andreas stares at her nonchalantly. Someone behind Andreas's back cries out that it's all true. From surprise, Andreas turns around, and Ivy stares intently at the same place. She continues to hold her sword in her hand. Vivian slowly but surely approaches them. She tells Ivy that Andreas saved her back then. She looks very determined. At the unexpected encounter, Andreas cries out her name, not believing his eyes. Ivy stares at her stunned and can't believe what she's hearing. Her eyes are wide and her lips are tight. Vivian stood next to Andreas. He continued to stand silently in the crosshairs of Ivy's sharp sword. A furious Ivy walks away from them. She puts her sword back on her belt and sobs as she tries to get away from them. As she walks between Andreas and Vivian, she shrieks in annoyance, addressing Andreas by his first and last name and warning him that she will continue to follow him. Vivian turns to follow her. Ivy moved away from them. Andreas and Vivian were alone, staring at each other in silence. Andreas looks at Vivian and says a timid, "Thank you." Vivian, without even looking at him, replies that he has nothing to thank her for and turns to him, calling him Mr. Fairy. Little Vivian's eyes filled with tears. A little more and she bursts into tears. Now she knows for sure that Andreas is Mr. Fairy. The beautiful Cromwell Manor building is illuminated by bright sunlight. The orange roof of the building is warmed by the rays of the sun. Emmy, Andreas's little sister, is sitting at her desk, carefully filling out some important paperwork. She is approached, calling her Lady Emmy, and informed that they are finished with cleaning the estate. Emmy stares intently at the man. Lupin's assistant stands in front of her desk holding a tray. Emmy thanks her guiltily and says that it must have been hard since the house has been abandoned for so many years. Lupin replies good-naturedly that it wasn't at all. Placing the tray on the table, Lupin turns to Emmy and says that they felt it would be wrong to go into the head of the family's private office and that it would be best if she looked at it herself first. Emmy agrees to her proposal and gets up from the table. Lupin stands obediently and waits for her. Emmy slowly rambles down the hallway, approaching her father's office. She looks a little scared. She stops near one of the doors and doesn't immediately decide to enter it. Emmy stops at a massive hand-carved door. She finds her father's study immediately. Suddenly, a memory pops into her mind. She remembers being scolded a lot for hiding behind that door from her brother during a game of hide-and-seek. Her eyes squint a little, and a slight smile appears on her face. She puts her hand on the doorknob and realizes it was so long ago. Emmy slowly opens the door to the dark room and is amazed at what she sees. Everything's turned upside down. A chair lying in the middle of the room. Window panes shattered. Books and old records are strewn across the floor. The office is pitch black and disorderly. Emmy walks carefully into the room, stepping over the items lying on the floor. She realizes that no one has been keeping an eye on the house. It's understandable why the study is in disarray. Suddenly, Emmy's gaze stops on something. She freezes. Tears instantly come to her eyes, her lips pressed together. On the floor, among the scattered things, she finds a broken frame. She reaches out to pick it up. Sitting on her lap, Emmy scrutinizes the picture frame she found. A fast train with gold inserts rushes along the mountains and fields. These lands are the Welton estate. Andreas squeezes his eyes together irritably. He turns to Mr. Salem, asking him about something that doesn't seem like he's being unreasonable. Andreas is about to lose his patience. A furious Salem sits across from him, crossing his arms across his chest. Multiple tattoos are visible on his elbows. He is frowning, the continent's best dark mage showing up in such a public place. Salem furrowed his eyebrows angrily. He addresses Andreas, calling him small, and says that he personally came to teach him, and he also complains. He talks about how Andreas is weak, so many people are after him. Salem lifts one eyebrow frowningly and stares at Andreas intently. He offers to get to his point. Andreas is annoyed that Salem simply ignored his question. The train car is filled with people. Salem and Andreas are sitting across from each other. Salem asks Andreas if he knows that the aura in his dantian and the mana in his heart are almost the same thing. Andreas nonchalantly replies that he knows that. A human body forms above them, with a pink light burning in the heart area and a blue light burning in the lower abdomen. Salem explains to Andreas that, in theory, he can use aura and mana, that it's impossible without a dual core, though they don't need one. Salem sits back woozily and tells Andreas that that's enough explanation. He calls himself the Great Salem and says he will teach Andreas his method of energy transfusion called translation. Andreas listens intently to what he tells him. 10 minutes pass. Andreas is completely immersed in the technique Salem told him. He feels pink and blue light in his chest and abdomen area, shifting from one to the other. The technique and its application are light. Salem puts his hand to his chin and looks at Andreas carefully. The latter sits silently across from him. He didn't think there was a way to turn heart mana into aura so quickly. Salem continues to stare at Andreas. Andreas, for his part, is amazed that Salem Edida himself has told him of such an incredible discovery. Salem rises from his seat and tells Andreas that he hopes he has at least a rough idea of what is going on, and tells him to keep practicing. Andreas sits still and looks at Salem obediently. Suddenly, Andreas remembers that he wanted to ask another important question that has been keeping him busy. Salem waves his hand to say goodbye and leave, but he stops to listen to what Andreas wants to ask him. He asks him loudly that maybe he knows something about his father and the House of Cromwell. He looks distraught. Salem nonchalantly turns back to Andreas. He was probably prepared for this conversation. He informs him that Cain was Morn's apprentice. Andreas opens his eyes wide in surprise. He is amazed at what he has heard and cannot believe it. His lips tighten. Salem angrily replies to him that he has already told Andreas that if he wants it, let him find out the details himself. He explains that the whole thing is too stressful. Andreas angrily tries to stop him, but all in vain. Mister suddenly dissolves and disappears right before his eyes. Before he knows it, Andreas is screaming loudly and calling his name. Andreas only thinks about the fact that Cain Cromwell was a dark mage. He looks very puzzled. Neither in the game, nor after entering this world, did he have any idea about it. The train in which Andreas is traveling is rushing somewhere at breakneck speed. Andreas is very happy that he is going home. He assumes that if he searches the house, he might find something there. The Cromwell estate looks very beautiful and noble. It is set amidst branching trees. Emmy walks into her father's office, followed by her brother Andreas, who enters. She turns to Andreas and tells him that Lupin has cleaned up nicely. He doesn't say anything back to her, but just silently looks at the room he's entered. Andreas was stunned by what he saw. He couldn't say a word. He opened his eyes wide and pressed his lips together. Andreas clarifies with his sister that this is his father's study. Emmy tells him that it is, but it was in a terrible state, so she replaced the old furniture with new. Andreas looks around and happily replies that this is a great solution and that it will now be possible to use it. Emmy holds a framed photo of their family in her hand. Despite the renovations, she left the most important things out. Emmy holds up the picture and shows it to Andreas. She looks very happy, winking with one eye. The smile never leaves her face. Andreas looks at the photograph with great affection. Tears come to his eyes and a blissful smile appears. He thinks about the strange feeling that keeps him going. He feels nostalgic, though at the same time these emotions seem foreign to him. Andreas touches the photograph with his hand and presses it as if it were a tablet. Andreas' eyes go wide at what he sees. He opens his mouth at what has surprised him very much. Emmy, too, is at a loss for words at what she sees and can't believe her eyes. A bright flash of light comes from the picture frame like the rays of a blazing sun. Andreas doesn't take his hand away from the frame, but Emmy continues to hold it. Suddenly, a loud bang is heard behind Andreas's back. He turns around sharply to see it. The sound comes from a rack of books. Suddenly, the wall of the shelf moves aside and a passage behind the wall is formed. Andreas and Emmy run up the aisle and can't figure out what it is. What's behind the rack of books? They look over there carefully. Andreas concludes what is happening. He realizes that touching the photo has triggered a magic circle. The shelving unit has been pulled back, revealing a secret door. It is necessary to find out what lies behind it as soon as possible. Andreas recalls the image of their father, Cain. He's standing with his back to them, staring off into the distance. He concludes that if the picture only activates when he and Emmy touch it together, then it is his father's inheritance or will. Andreas's eyebrows furrow, his gaze growing serious. He decides he has to go in there first. There must be something incredible there. Andreas stops in a secret passage and addresses Emmy, saying that he will check everything there and tells her to wait outside. Emmy tries to contradict him that she can't let him go alone. Andreas, fearing for his sister, tries to explain to her that she can't handle that kind of magic and that it's very dangerous. Emmy, annoyed, tries to contradict her brother again, but Andreas shrieks angrily at his sister. She agrees in frustration and stays behind the secret passage waiting for her brother to return. Emmy leaves, closing the door behind her and asking her brother to be extra careful. Andreas, smiling slightly, tells her not to worry, that everything will be fine.